Welcome to the Arts and Oddities podcast with A.M. Hall, starring A.M. Hall. Now, here is A.M. Hall.
Welcome to Art and Oddities with A.M. Hall, where I talk about anything that strikes my fancy, to include all kinds of creative works, from children's cartoons to underground zines, to identity politics and everything in between. My guests and I will discuss how art impacts and reflects culture and counterculture, enables individualism and conformity, and have loads of fun along the way. I am your host, A.M. Hall, aka Anthony Bonafini, aka Galena Storm, aka Aquaces Mancuso. Today, I'll be telling you about filming in the park and how important it is to always have your wand ready. And in part 2, I have Reverend Panik EVlynn Bedlam back to talk a little bit about style tribes and explain to her how Zorro fits into them. Stay tuned. Most of my time lately has been occupied with making this film with Evie. We're making a film that she wrote and directed, and one of the things that I made a lot of the costumes. I've been talking about that a lot. I've also been I'm not sure what the name is for this particular position in film, but in live plays it's called stage management, where, I keep track of where we are in the script and make sure the actors are on cue, and making sure the director knows where we are too. Every time Evie has turned to me and said, "Hey, where are we?" I've been there ready with another line. Sort of been acting as a crossover, doing that and costumes at the same time, so it was very exciting painting one of my actors' faces. The character has an eyeball right in the middle of their forehead. This is the same character who's wearing the bathrobe that I keep talking about. Um, oh man, the character is wonderful, and our actress is wonderful. I might have her on as a guest at some point or another. So, in order to get this eye on the character's forehead, first I had to take a gem that I had and spirit glue it onto the actor's forehead, and then I took some white makeup that I had lying around. I sterilized it first, of course, with alcohol, and then I took the white and just painted an eye shape and a black outline and drew that right around so that it looks like an eyeball, and it really does look fantastic. And one of the other things I'm also doing is, I guess I'm also the props master. I'm making sure that all of the props are where they should be when they should be there. Because of the magic of film, the characters have things in their hands, and then suddenly they don't have them in their hands anymore, and then suddenly they do again. So wherever we are at in the script, I have to make sure that the actors have their props exactly when they're supposed to have their props, and usually as soon as the director is calling, "Hey, the character needs the wand right now," "Oh, there it is, thanks." We've been filming. The first 2 days of filming have happened so far, and we've been filming in the local park near the creek. And the very first day, we were almost delayed by the weather. The rain stopped almost as soon as our start time came, and then started up again as soon as we were done for the day. So that was very, very fortuitous. We seem to have sort of disrupted the local dog walking population as they as all the people walking their dogs through the park were, stopping to stare at what we were doing, but whatever. um, Another one of our actors, screamed, "We're thespians!" at one of the local dog walkers, so that was pretty funny. The biggest challenge for this entire project has been coordinating all these people, because we're not paying our actors, so they have to fit this into their spare time. And the hardest thing is coordinating all these people and getting them to the place to perform while it's still daylight out. So it's been a challenge. Fortunately, it's summertime right now, and the sun is out for a long time, almost till 8 o'clock, I think. And that makes me feel all right, because what I'm doing, we prepared so well. Unfortunately, I'm doing a lot of sitting around waiting for, exactly when I am needed, which I suppose that's the best thing to have, is someone on crew who's standing around waiting, because you didn't prepare well enough when people are running around like crazy people, and I'm not doing much of that. So, we're doing all right with this. So I think I've said this at least once before that preparation is key. The moral of the story: make sure to prepare ahead of time, and you won't run into problems later. I am here with the Reverend Panik Bedlam, also known as Evie for short. Hi, Evie.
Hi, how are you today?
Oh, I'm doing great. And we're talking about style tribes and what style tribes are.
I don't know what those are. What are style tribes?
All right. A style tribe is the way someone dresses to identify oneself as a member of a certain subculture.
Like Zorro?
Yes, exactly like Zorro. Actually, cosplay is another subculture of style tribes. So, dressing up like characters, especially putting on costumes and whatnot, that is another form of style tribe.
Oh, okay. So, well, what's first type of style tribe?
Well, most style tribes are street fashion,
Oh,
like
okay.
punks or goths or nerds, and these people are instantly identifiable by their clothing. And if someone is instantly identifiable as a member of one of these subculture groupings by their clothing and by the way they're dressed, then that is a style tribe.
Oh, okay. I think I can get on board with this if it's about subculture stuff, because as a ordained subgenius minister, I have special knowledge. Because subgeniuses, they aren't subgenius meaning they're under it. They are geniuses of under things, like undergarments seems to be a particular specialty. So as long as we talk a little bit about underwear, I'm sure that I can hang with whatever this is. So,
Well, there are certain subcultures that rely heavily on things like petticoats.
oh, indeed, like steampunk kind of stuff.
There's steampunk. There's
Goth
also
wear.
there's Lolita
Okay.
and goth too. Yeah, goth leans heavily on corsetry too. Although that has moved away from undergarments and towards outer garments.
So
But
there you go.
so yeah,
Underwear, very important.
underwear
Tribal underwear.
underwear is very important. Tribal underwear. Do you know why we should talk about style tribes?
Well, other than you're interested in it, I assume that we're talking about because it has to do with cultural identities and such, and how one expresses oneself, and that's kind of a core concept of this show.
It does have to do with expression of identity, but one of the reasons I think we should really talk about it is because of how many misconceptions there are, not only by other subcultures or by, the mainstream culture, and also by other generations too.
Well, what kind of misconceptions?
Sometimes there's a generational gap with style tribal.
Oh, okay.
If someone goes out there dressed like a punk with body mods, hair in weird colors. There's something to that, and sometimes these people are misunderstood as being things like drug users and whatnot. And there's been, there are a lot of misconceptions.
Negative stereotyping.
Negative stereotypes. Those are the words I'm looking for. Thank you for that.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about punk and generation gaps. In the great rock and roll swindle, Malcolm McLaren specifically says punk was about trying to generate and profit from generation gaps. But he was talking specifically about the difference between the baby boomers and Gen X.
Hmm.
We've had at least a generation now that we're to the millennials where punk isn't necessarily a rebellion against the hippies anymore. It's kind of its own culture that's rebelled against itself a few times.
It's its own thing, yeah. Well, and there's not only, the rebellion against the older people, and not just the misconception doesn't always happen from the older generation to the newer generation, although that is more common. The younger people can misconstrue things that the older people did when they were young. For example, the miniskirt of the 60s. And when we go back and watch things like the original Star Trek series, the miniskirt at that time was a symbol of feminism. And it made Nichelle Nichols and the other women on Star Trek feel empowered to wear them. Whereas, the younger people watching the old Star Trek now look at the miniskirts on the show and think, "Oh my gosh,
They're objectifying women.
they're being sexualized." Yeah, objectifying them. But for the women on the show and Nichelle Nichols, that just wasn't how that wasn't the option.
Well, I've discussed with other modern feminists about the idea of wanting to be sexualized a little bit just for the purposes of being attractive. And, yeah, that's a different idea. People change on not only what they think is attractive, but what they think is appropriate. And that's a constant back and forth challenge.
And it is sort of like a swing now. In the late 80s and 90s, swimwear was all about being very exposed. How skimpy can the swimwear be? Whereas now, people are looking to cover up. People are, swimming in things like rash guards, which are, very concealing.
Well, we've went from itsy bitsy teeny weeny polka dot bikinis to like now men who were wearing kind of speedos and stuff like the bare minimum for a while. A lot of them are wearing like kind of the same things women wore in Victorian times.
Yeah, yeah.
And women's fashion always is changing, but like, yeah, that's interesting. Like, what considers modesty seems to play in from what you're talking about, but also what's considered alternative conformity and nonconformity seem like a feature that you're talking about as well.
Yeah, yeah. And it seems like the modern rebellion against what's come before is a return to conservatism, at least visually.
Oh, okay, yeah, I can see that. Like, it seems like what they call hipsters now, a lot of that seems to be just taking what you find at the Salvation Army or whatever and kind of appropriating it as if it's cool. But then again, punk was about a lot of that too.
Yeah, yeah. And that's why, in the 80s, that's why grunge looked the way it did, was because that was what was available in the thrift stores during the 80s, was all the leftovers from the 70s and from the hippies.
Yeah, and you try to make it work or you rip it apart and put it back together like that self-identity. But I'd assume like people like preppies and stuff, like the mainstream stuff, that's a style tribe too, because we're talking about
Oh,
kind
it
of
certainly is, I'm going to move on just a little bit. I'm going to go into my personal history with style tribalism.
Oh, okay, maybe that'll help. Sure.
When I was in high school, about the time you're supposed to be, forming your cultural identity, I did not have a style tribe. I dressed like a nerd. Um, but my friends were not nerds. My friends were all goths.
I was in a similar circumstance. I had some punks and other weirdos. I kind of tried to dress like a new waver, but about 15 years too late. A common thing people would say is I dressed like Ducky from Pretty in Pink, I think it is. I
Okay.
could be getting my Molly Ringwald movies confused, but yeah, just trying to figure out what it is, and sometimes you make some very drastic errors trying to be usefully different. So
Yeah, yeah, experimenting and well,
the
that's the
nerd
time
nerd
for it.
clothes tends to be pretty practical though, but you try to express yourself. Mostly it's in weird
But no,
T-shirts,
I
but
didn't. I didn't actually start dressing well until much later in life. Like I was well into college before I, began figuring out, what pants looked good on me or what shirts looked good on me. Wearing clothes that were a little bit more fitted than before. But I had previously been wearing very baggy clothes because I didn't know what else to wear. I was kind of, bumbling about.
I kind of didn't find my style until much later either. Like, I spent some time in Korea and got to see what the popular look over there was, and that sort of inspired me because a lot of stuff from over there transfers back and forth more than people kind of realize. But I don't know, it kind of just having a different perspective. And no, you put it together over time, and I'm one of those people who I kind of dress a lot weirder than I did in high school. I kind of tried to fit in a little bit more than I do now. Now I'm kind of come to terms with it. But now for what you were saying, like where it does let you kind of recognize, I think in the first episode we were talking about how with my pal Nix we recognized each other because we both kind of dress sort of the same way. So
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. And even though I'm not a member of the punk tribe, I don't dress punk. I don't consider myself to be of the punk mindset. I find myself being attracted to people that are of the punk mindset, and I
that's
actually
because we're awesome.
well, yeah, you are. But, I actually met Nix before you did. I immediately said, "You're someone who needs to be my friend." Unfortunately, we didn't really hit it off right away, and we had to become friends over time. And I think that some of that may have had to do with the fact that I was dressed like a prep.
An initial response, and then you kind of became friends through me a little bit later. But it also took you a while longer to figure out what you two had in common too, because you weren't necessarily wearing it on your
Okay.
sleeve.
And I think style tribalism really does matter. And that's actually one of the reasons is recognition of the fellow members of your tribe and the recognition of a person's identity. Not just this is who I am, but also this is how I want to be treated by society at large.
Okay, like I can see that. Like you remind me of that thing that goes on now that you were telling me with the safety pins.
Oh yeah, the basically there's a thing with a safety pin going on right now. This is probably dating this podcast quite a bit if you're listening to it a few years later. But there's a thing going on right now where you can express yourself as an ally to minorities by just wearing a safety pin, an empty safety pin on your clothes.
Well, we could get into stuff that's more dated. Those bands, the that you'd wear on your hands that had around your wrist that had the different organizations on them to show your support in different colors for stuff. There's always
Okay.
something.
That's still going around, kind of, I think. Like, I see people wearing
But
bands all
then
the
again,
time.
there's people who wore yellow ribbons in support of troops. Like
Mm-hmm.
all these little icons, they add up, but they seem to be a feature of it too. Check your flair.
Minimum 14 pieces of flair. And and there are other subcultures too. Like, I consider myself to be a member of the of queer culture, but I don't really dress in such a way that fellow members of queer culture can recognize me. I mean,
Well, then that's so. You mean more like that's how you express? Like that's one of your things that you consider
yeah,
something you need to mix in there?
I feel like I should, work in a bit more queerness. Is that weird?
No, well, yes, because queer is a word that means uh, weird, but yeah,
It literally, yeah, queer literally means weird. That's awesome.
as a clockwork orange. But anyhow,
But I'd like to really bring this back around to to why this is important to me specifically, and I think it's because of I didn't really have a style tribe in high school, like I mentioned before, and I spoke with several of my peers about it at the time, and, they were talking about. I asked them how they became goths, how they, started dressing the way they did, and they didn't really have a very good answer for me. They talked about how you don't choose your tribe, you just fall into one. And I did.
I think some of that might be like what music you choose too, because that seems to be a strong association. And from talking to you, you kind of were into whatever, not very strongly music wise.
Yeah, yeah, that's true too. But I never really did fall into a tribe. I never, figured that out. I listened to Weird Al and Disney musicals. I mean,
Both those things are popular and fun. Like, but you can't really. I don't know. Weird Al fans are kind of a interesting tribe of their own.
they certainly are. I feel like nerd culture has sort of swung all the way back around and come into the mainstream. Like,
Fandom culture too, like you were saying
yeah,
about the cosplay at the beginning of this. Now that we've kind of talked about what it is.
yeah, yeah. And, I've actually, gone out cosplaying as Steven Universe and no one has noticed because Steven Universe is a character who dresses like a normal person, but, he does have a very specific outfit that, I happen to own. A shirt with a star on it and a pair of jeans, and, if unless you know what you're looking for, that just looks like a normal outfit.
Sure, this seems like something we'll talk about more in depth, especially as we get some people who kind of represent this
Yeah, that would
stuff
be
on.
that would be
Because,
great.
like, you're very concerned about expression, and even though you kind of didn't have your own thing back in the day, it made you more observant of other people and their kind of trends and stuff. So,
That's one thing that I've always noticed. Like, that's the very first thing I notice about someone is what they're wearing and how that falls into certain subcategories.
so you have a little outsider's perspective. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
At the same time, like I think now you have a pretty sophisticated look now. Like I don't think that nobody dresses like you.
Yeah.
So, people talk to you on the street.
Yeah, I do feel like I've stepped up my game, but it has been very deliberate on my part.
Which it's something that I've learned through my research on this topic is not just how to step up your game, but how to step up your game and still be true to who you are and express yourself. For example, there's a coat that I own. It's sort of a spring fall coat that is very goth. It's got some, lacing up the back. It's black. Um, and it's not something that I would normally wear. I don't normally dress in goth clothing, but the fact that I've incorporated this coat into my wardrobe, I make it work. And I feel like it by itself adds a little bit of glamour to my overall look.
Yeah, and I think that it probably helps people get a gist of who you actually are, because it does kind of give like a little bit of flair to what you do, a little bit of glamour, and yeah.
So, yeah, don't be afraid to change things up, try to express yourself a little bit better, and I do believe we are just about out of time. So, why don't we wrap things up? Okay, well, Reverend Panik, thank you for being with me today. Hope to have you on again soon.
Thanks for having me. I hope to be on again soon.
And that's just about it for today. Please stick with us while we wrap things up. Thanks for listening to the Art and Oddities podcast with A.M. Hall. That's our show for today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and give us a review on either iTunes or Google Play. Or, if you're listening via YouTube, please remember to like and subscribe. You can also follow us on Facebook. Join our group at facebook.com/groups/oddartpodcast or on Twitter at twitter.com/artodditiespod. The production and editing of this podcast has been provided by Reverend Panik EVlynn Bedlam, and without her it would not exist. If you'd like to support this podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/panikbedlam. That's PANIKBEDLAM. As we produce more shows, we will be putting more content on Patreon exclusively for patrons. You can also help Panik by buying her books or tarot cards. You can find them by searching Panik Bedlam on lulu.com and thegamecrafter.com. Direct updates and show notes are available at panikbedlam.com/podcast. Mentioned in this episode is mine and Evie's mutual friend, Nyx Eradicatus. Find her videos on YouTube. Links are available in the show notes. For all the fashion talk in this episode, we forgot to mention friend of the show, Mr. Tej66, who has appeared to talk about clothes on this very podcast. A GoFundMe page has been set up to get him some new clothes. There is a link in the show notes. Our theme music, Doxel Dance in Spacetime, or Belial and His Seven Wives, was composed and performed by Kion Huru Orion, or as I know him, Michael. Thanks, Michael. If you would like to contact the show with comments or suggestions, you can email us at artodditiespodcast@gmail.com. Next week, I'll talk about how sometimes making art is an uphill battle, and hopefully a few encouraging words to help you up that same hill. And then I talk to E.W. Motomac about cooking in cast iron, cooking magic, and food as free speech. Don't miss it. That about wraps it up. Remember, the highest form of magic is doing, and expressing yourself is art. This is A.M. Hall, signing off.